Hello there. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Hi there. Hi, I'm Max. Welcome. It's really an honour to be here, part of a really important weekend for British artisan cheese. We've just had Mark Hicks, pretty amazing, bit of a hero of mine. And then after this, we've got Sharpham Estate doing a kind of wine and cheese matching, what grows together goes together, half hour, which is super exciting. So make sure that if you're planning to watch that, come what may, kind of tune in exactly 8:30 for that. Good evening. So tonight we're going to have a kind of briefish look at British artisan cheese, what was, what is, and what's next. And I thought quite hard about this, especially about the cheeses that we've got with it. We've got some amazing stuff. It's everything from Caerphilly all the way through to St James. Now, these 8 cheeses can be defined pretty neatly, or divided up pretty neatly, by old school and new school. But the more I thought about that division, the less sense it made to me. And so I started really to think quite hard about the question of what was, what is, and what's next for British cheese. And I think answering that in a way that asks the right sort of questions and really gets to the bottom of it is a little bit complicated, but also really interesting, hopefully. So fair warning, this is a little abstract, but if you're okay with that, I'd love to kind of dive in, and then as soon as it's finished, you've got an amazing practical cheese and wine pairing just to kind of chill out. So welcome. So in terms of tonight, the thing that really cropped up to me when I was thinking about this as a topic was most of my British cheese history knowledge, I guess, obviously comes from work, being a cheesemonger, and working with some amazing British cheese producers and those from the continent as well. But it also comes from really one of my favourite food writers, full stop, let alone about cheese, is Major Patrick Rance, a bit of an eccentric fellow in the mid 20th century that did a lot before Neal's Yard but after Paxton's obviously and before us, to really highlight and try and protect amazing British cheese. But the other thing I realised when I was thinking about this book is that I didn't really understand it properly until I'd read another book which seems completely unrelated, called John Berger's Ways of Seeing. So this is about British history, and the thing about British history is and history in general is that it's really hard to understand unless you do a couple of things. So you've got to take into account the kind of biases, preoccupations, and desires of us, especially as we're the kind of heirs to this legacy. We've got a lot of our own self-image wrapped up in this. So depending on how we feel about ourselves and our country, we can either project everything was terrible onto the past or everything was great. And obviously it's a bit of both. This evening, I'm going to kind of question British cheese a little bit, but in a really positive way, hopefully, and really to kind of provoke a discussion rather than kind of settle it. So hopefully you'll kind of take it in that spirit. And like British patriotism in general, the British brand of patriotism, I think, is questioning. And so I think hopefully the British brand of cheese loving is also questioning by the same token. So fantastic. And I guess my conclusion will be roughly that cheese is in its golden age right now. Not in the 19th century, not in the 17th century, not even in the 15th century, but right now. And we're quite unique in Europe in that respect. I think there's an argument to be made that as wonderful as France's and Italy's food and cheese culture is, their terroir cheeses might have seen their best days perhaps at the beginning of the 20th century, whereas our best days are now and hopefully yet to come. So we'll kind of flesh that out, and it shows up something quite interesting and amusing and self-deprecating, I think, about British food culture and culture in general. So cool. So the thing about British food culture is that I also read a cheesemonger that I encourage you to read. He's an amazing food writer as well. Stephen Jenkins is an American. So he doesn't really have a dog in the fight when it comes to European cheese. And so somebody said, what about Spanish ones? I think that's a different talk, but I think Spain's kind of in the same boat as Britain in a lot of ways, because its artisan cheese industry got decimated in the 20th century, and they're rediscovering who they are and defining who they are in just the same way in the 21st century, definitely. So they're a kind of slightly different case. And so, yeah, Stephen Jenkins is a wickedly funny writer, and he lays into every European country pretty much equally. So he has a lot of smack to talk about French and Italian food chauvinism. The French chauvinism being national and the Italian chauvinism being regional. But of Britain, of the British Isles specifically, he says something amazing, which I can't really disagree with, I'm afraid. He says the Welsh, the English, the Scottish and the Irish couldn't really be more different. You couldn't pack that much diversity of thought, language, culture into such a small space anywhere else in the world. It's quite unique. But the one thing they all seem to have in common is a kind of collective disinterest in their own food. And if you balk at that claim, then I ask you to imagine telling somebody from Italy the minutiae of the difference between an Irish stew, a Scottish stew, a Welsh stew, and an English stew. If they could see the difference, I doubt they could be convinced to care. And also in every British household, we have stories of, if we have British grandparents, that is, stories of grandparents putting on the roast, everything in the oven, all the vegetables in to boil, 9 in the morning, going to church, then going for a walk, then going to the pub, and then coming back and eating the whole lot, the incinerated bunch, all together. And it was a uniquely pragmatic, charming, and interesting and sweet way of looking at food, but by no means one that suffused food with meaning or romance. It just didn't. And so where does that go back to? Now, I blame Henry VIII, actually. So Henry VIII made a kind of break with the Catholic Church. And so this kind of creeping Puritanism came into our food culture. So one of the most interesting periods of British food culture was during the Middle Ages, right up into the Tudors, sort of by way of the Dark Ages. But where there was sort of much exuberance and some of the best of British food culture in looking outwards, basically, getting things from around the known universe, really, and applying it to our cooking. It wasn't inward looking at all. And there was lots of pleasure and gluttony and fun had with food. And so as we kind of move from Henry VIII onwards, you start having a very interesting way of looking at food. So I like to contrast this with France. So in a Catholic country like France or Italy, so let's take France for a second, if you're looking at an oozing brie dropping off the side of a plate and you're thinking, that doesn't just look delicious, it's borderline sexy, then really, as a religious Catholic, what have you done? You're guilty of lust, gluttony at least, probably a bit of idolatry. But here's the hack. As a Catholic, you can go into a box the next morning and apologise and probably eat the same cheese and look at it in the same way with the priest you just confessed to the next evening. Bob's your uncle. Whereas if you are if you're a Lutheran, then even the thought of being caught in a compromising position with an oozing brie or the like is going to send you straight to hell. And so in food culture in this country, you start having words like naughty, sinful, indulgent, guilty pleasure, which you just don't have those kind of sentiments towards food on the continent. And so you actually, that's good and bad. You end up having this kind of British way of looking at food, a way of seeing food, which is that its utility, or its specifically its utility is in its yield, its efficiency, kind of its quality, is it tasty or not? I mean, that matters. And how much money does it make? And so it involves some craft and some pleasure, but crucially not too much pleasure. That's the crucial aspect. And if you think that's limited to the times in which this country was the most Protestant and the most fervent in their beliefs, that just transmuted as we went through the Enlightenment and into the empiricist times of the 17th and 18th century, and then which paved the way for the Industrial Revolution. You start getting this sense that it's not going to send you to hell necessarily to love your food and to think about it and lust after it and concentrate on it exclusively, or even talk about it at the dinner table. But this Puritanism gets replaced with this self-deprecation and this anti-pretentiousness sentiment, which you never know, you might be thinking that as you're listening to this as Brits. But nonetheless, that's very much a feature of our food. If you try and extol the virtues of British cheese, or even a dish in a way that invokes poetry or art, through most of British history, you would have been laughed out of everywhere from the pub to the seminar room. So that was the reality of it. And that actually extended all the way up until, I would say, the 70s. So this is really interesting because Claudia Rodin talks a lot about British food culture. She was one of our first food writers in the mid-20th century that was kind of a roving reporter in the mode of Richard Ford in the 19th century. And she went around in a lot of highfalutin circles in London, the kind of dinner parties you can imagine Noel Coward holding court at. And she said that one of the worst things you could do was bring up food, even if you'd been to somewhere like Florence. Don't you dare talk about the things you wear. Talk about the art and the architecture. And that's not because the British are immune to romance or to art or to culture or even to complex thought. They just don't apply it to food. And that's a very recent development. So all of that sounds a little negative, but it also means that there's something quite unique about British food culture, which is that we've been more outward looking than any other country. So whilst the height of interest and importance and meaning as a dish, say, in Burgundy would have been pike perch, which was the local fish with a beurre blanc and butter and wine, and a pouligny Montrachet. Sublime, but about as inward-looking as it could possibly be. Whereas food historians tend to think of the most interesting periods, the most exciting periods of British cuisine, when we were acting as a globalizing nation, for better or for worse. So during the Middle Ages, the thing I think of is an Eccles cake, because we're going to talk about Lancashire in a second, and it's so quintessentially English, right? And it is, because it's British food culture at its best in a pastry shell. Spices, fruits, thinking about food that's collected like a magpie from the edge of the known universe. You wouldn't even know whether it was a Persian dish or something from Spain or something somewhere else. It's really amazing, and so that's wrapped up in this tiny little Eccles cake, and you have it on the side of some Lancashire cheese. That's British food culture. Not necessarily even at the time the cheese itself, because many people in the region in Lancashire would have been having that cheese as a kind of a necessity. And so if you think about that, it wasn't even until the Restoration, so after Thomas Cromwell really got our Puritanism going, and then Charles II comes back, he comes back with a continental way of seeing, which is that actually cheese isn't that bad and you can cook with it. So if it's the first time during the Restoration that Brits thought to cook with cheese, he was like, it's so important to the French and so meaningful that an endive gratin, so chicory with a cheese sauce, could make it to a king's table. You can't say fairer than that, and it's essentially a really lovely way of looking at cheese, but it wasn't British. It was brought in by our absolute kind of European uber class aristocracy that were no more British than that endive gratin. So most of our history, our cheese hasn't been imbued with meaning. So therefore, the definition of British artisan cheese would have been a very narrow definition of artisan. So made by somebody who cared, people might have noticed its quality, People thought it was delicious and might pay a bit more for it, but that's about it. And so now we're going to ask about what British artisan cheese means now, because actually the definition of British artisan cheese, I think, has changed since Patrick Arantz. So this is the introduction of the concept of terroir, this idea that essentially you can imbue a cheese with meaning, I think. So Francis and Bronwyn Percival have this amazing book, and I think they define terroir in one of the most kind of interesting and moving ways I've ever seen. And that's essentially that it's placeness. It's this idea that certain fermented products can taste of the place that they come from. But that means a lot. That means all of the swirling variables, from natural history to the soil, to the pasture, to the climate, to the season. But all things like intangible causal chains that end up with a flavour, a volatile aromatic compound that you can taste, that start off with everything from gender politics to the local wars and history. So that's this idea of terroir. But it's still a very British conception because it's an intrinsic set of properties. It's very empiricist. It's something you can demonstrate. As highfalutin as it sounds, it's all very sensible if you think about it, and it's a product of a cheese. So if terroir is just an intrinsic property, then we may have had terroir cheeses for history, throughout British history. But the important thing that comes from the continent is that all of that is literally meaningless unless you cultivate a way of seeing. So you have to imbue a cheese like a Caerphilly with meaning. It's not just sustenance, it's not just delicious, it's my identity. It has pretensions of greatness in the best possible way. It wants to be more than food and really get up on a level with art and literature or anything else that's truly important culturally about the world. So somebody's just asked why we don't have a word for terroir, and that's because Wittgenstein would say, essentially, language doesn't represent a thought or the real world. It is the thought, and it is reality in its own way. And so it's crucial that we don't have a word for terroir in English, which shows to me that we still getting our heads around it. Very much still getting our heads around it. I know I am. I don't know about you. So this word terroir, as soon as you go abroad or you meet a cheesemonger or a cheesemaker that really has a grip on it, or a winemaker for that matter, then suddenly terroir becomes a new word for you that makes sense, and you've changed your way of seeing. And so that way of seeing was not present in British food culture until, I would say, in any great consistency, until the 90s. Therefore, by my definition of terroir, the first terroir British cheeses started off in the 90s. No matter how tasty cheeses before that might have been, and I would argue they're tastier now than I imagine they ever were. So let's talk about some cheese. I'm gonna go through this, and as I said, I'm gonna give a very biased perspective on all of this as a cheese lover, but as somebody that's just taking this from a particular angle. So I'd be very interested if during this or afterwards, if people disagree. That's kind of the point. So I'm not giving the final word on this stuff. Just a caveat. So the first cheese up is Gorwithka Caerphilly. So one of my favourite cheeses right now, made in Somerset by the Trethowan brothers. It essentially, when it was made in Wales, in the town of Caerphilly, it was sort of a Cornish pasty of cheeses. It couldn't have been more British in its conception and its execution. Basically, it was a cheese made to be taken down a mine. So it was a hand's width. They didn't bother about the rind really at all. They just dusted it in oat dust pretty much, and it was for taking a bite. So you could take a bite and eat the whole slice of cheese without ever touching the paste. Great. Can't think of anything more British, at least at that time. And no doubt some people liked it, some people didn't, but not something with terroir by any stretch of the imagination, because part of terroir is the maker or the consumer seeing it in a particular way and therefore imbuing it with meaning. I really don't believe that happened. And so essentially, we move it to Somerset because it's pragmatic, very British, very pragmatic to make it while cheddar's aging. We stop making it for the same reasons of pragmatism, because it's not considered to be as useful during the war effort by the Milk Marketing Board as other cheeses like a cheddar. And then it's taken back up by the Trethowan brothers off a recipe from Chris Duckett. And what they do is they see it with new eyes. The way I understand this is because I think of the French Mucor mold that are around the outside, that they've started thinking about not yield, not even flavour in and of itself, but quality, bringing up the nature of the grass and the soil, and making something that's truly delicious and rooted in a place, something with placeness, something with terroir. Totally new project, I would say, and a new product. And so you have this cheese that has this incredible breakdown underneath the rind that's mushroomy and complex and a lemony centre. So I like to think sometimes about Bleu de Gex, which is a cheese from the Jura Mountains in France. Get me in a time machine right now, back to 1960, when it was made without a blue starter culture. It went blue because of these amazing molds on the outside of alpine violets. 1960 was the time to try a Bleu de Gex, not now. 2021 is the time to choose to try this. Not at any point, not any cheese made in Caerphilly compared to this, not any cheese since. This is the real deal. This is the first Caerphilly, I would argue, with terroir. So we're in a golden age. Next up, we've got, and so in that sense, sorry, I've called it an old wave cheese, but for all intents and purposes, it's a brand new cheese. It's a new wave. It's a new way of looking at stuff. So give me Pitchfork and this over anything made in the 19th century, 17th or 16th. So now we're on to Kirkens, Lancashire. So this is from, this is essentially from Gusnar. It's from a long tradition of Lancashire cheeses. Now, the first Lancashire, and some of the cheeses made in that region, so it probably wouldn't have been called a Lancashire, would have been made by the monks, the Catholic monks, under the kind of supervision of the Norman invaders to recreate Roquefort. Sheep's milk, because that's what they grazed up there. It was open, it was blue. It was there to kind of give William the Conqueror really a sense of home. He was recreating Roquefort. So that was probably, I would argue, before this, the last terroir cheese, because somebody bothered to give it some meaning above and beyond its sustenance. It was a very French project at that point. And so an interesting thing I found out rather recently is that in Yorkshire, but it would have gone over to Lancashire and elsewhere, there was transhumance. So there's a lot of commonality, I think, between Yorkshire and the Auvergne, right? They would have taken their cows up into the mountains. There were actual stone buildings in Yorkshire, or the remnants of them, where the farmers would have slept with their herds during the summer months. That still, in very few cases, happens in Europe. They've been stretching that out for a really long time. But during the 17th and 18th century, we were after the Enlightenment. Everybody wants to make everything efficient and better. And so they develop all sorts of techniques of standardizing the process of making this cheese, making the transition to cow's milk, making sure that the feed is evened out all throughout the year. And so suddenly you have a very English cheese, something that does the job, gets the job done. And I don't believe there would have been much fight back against this, because if you'd have told a farmer that I can make your life easier in every possible way, your cheese more consistent and make you more money, but you'll lose meaning, they would have laughed at you. Whereas if you go to the Auvergne region, you could barely pry salads, tradition, everything about it, all of the difficulty of that life out of a French maker's cold dead hands. So couldn't be more different. And that's not because the Yorkshire mind is any less capable of discerning the ethereal than the French. We just apply it to landscapes and paintings and poetry and prose. We just don't apply it to cheese until now. Thanks to people like the Kirkhams and of course Andy Swinscoe, who is very much a one-person terroir, I would argue. So this cheese is the product of the territorial obsession, I think, I would argue, that we have in modern British cheese culture. So the idea, really, I think, when I hear territorial, I see people get quite dewy-eyed, and I think it's a byword for British terroir, for the golden age of British cheese, for the thing that we need to be getting back to. So there's a historian in the 50s called Val Check, and I think he gives us a bit of a reality check, terrible pun intended. He says of the territorials, cheese was merely good or bad, thick or thin, new or old, rich or flat, so just full fat or skimmed, and some possessed a better reputation than others, and that's it. And so basically territorials went through a battle royale based on the ideas of quality that were British, the recipients of our ways of thinking that apply to Locke, Berkeley and Hume and Adam Smith. Basically, you eliminate everything in a region, in a county, whether it had been blue or soft, whatever the milk type, would all have been called Cheshire, for example. And we got rid of the ones that were actively terrible, and some of them tasted disgusting, apparently. And then the refinement procedure went along with essentially what tasted good, but also made the most money and was the most efficient. And there was no counterbalancing force as there was in the Auvergne. So the Auvergne, of course, have supermarket Cantal, but they still have Salaires Tradition. And so there's been always a tension between those two things, but there wasn't a tension in the Yorkshire Dales. So when you talk about the Milk Marketing Board, often people talk about it in the 20th century, it kind of decimated British artisan cheese, like it was a spaceship that came down like the Empire, and British artisan cheesemakers were the resistance. It wasn't like that. We get the institutions we deserve, I think, and it was just the Milk Marketing Board, its desire to help during the war effort, but also when it got into bed with supermarkets in the 50s and 60s, it was the logical conclusion of everything we were driving cheese towards from the 17th century at least onwards, really getting going in the 19th century, and then really getting going further still in the 20th. And so I would say that Kirkham's Lancashire is a product of new British terroir heads, from the Kirkhams to Neil's Yard, who have forged something. So it's not a Lancashire of Lancashire, it's a Lancashire of the new British food culture, of the neo-rurals at Neil's Yard. It's a new way of seeing, and now it has terroir when it didn't before. So now we're on to Montgomerys Cheddar. So Montgomerys Cheddar is this amazing cheese. It's absolutely one of my favourites. It's well known in France now, not just as a joke, cheddar, but as something that's really seriously good quality and a world-class cheese. So cheddar is this, as a process, is really interesting. Everyone started calling their cheese cheddar in the region once Cheddar Gorge became popular. They only wrap it in cloth, not because they want to develop a certain rind or a flavour profile, but because of the Gulf Stream, and you don't want cheeses exploding on racks. And essentially, it's the product of what we sometimes refer to as the golden age of British cheesemaking in the 19th century. Mainly, there's a guy behind this called Lloyd, and he was the guy that discovered, or really thought about, he applied Enlightenment and empiricist scientific reasoning to discover the lactic acid coagulation process of the format of cheese. He's not the godfather of Montgomerys Cheddar. I would argue he's the godfather of Cathedral City. Cathedral City is the logical conclusion of the old wave British cheese project, and Montgomerys Cheddar is the conclusion of the new wave artisan British cheese project. So we have the French to thank in a lot of ways for Montgomerys Cheddar, just as much as we did anyone in the region, and now Jamie Montgomery. So yes. So and as I would say, if you gave me a time machine and gave me any cheddar before this, I'd be interested to try it. Whereas if I went to France and you gave me a time machine, then I'd honestly, every modern PDO cheese in France, as much as I love nearly all of them, if you could give me a choice to swap all of them with their parents from 1870 to 1970, I'd bite your hand off. And I would not do that with Britain. So that's what's so wonderful about where we are right now. So it's coming up to 8:30. So now anybody that wants to go over to the Sharpham winery, I implore you to do that. Get there on time. I don't want to take any viewers away from them, and they're doing something amazing. But if you want to hang out here a bit longer, you're welcome to. And if you want to move on, the rest of this will be recorded, so don't worry about it. So now we're from Montgomerys Cheddar on to Stilton. So Stilton is one of my favourite cheeses. But for me, it's about as New World as it gets. So if you were thinking about an objection to the argument I've been making so far, I think you could object to it with one word: Stilton. What about Stilton, right? And so Richard Ford, who was a bit of a sort of proto-Keith Lord that was out and about in the 19th century, really said that there was nothing in Spain at the time that could touch Stilton or Parmesan. So in the rest of Europe, Stilton and Parmesan were being talked about in the same breath. Real quality. But I would argue that on the continent they saw it in a very different way to we saw it domestically. And that comes out because essentially in the 1970s there was this sea change happening, even amongst Stilton makers. So they'd stopped using letting the blue mold occur naturally and started kind of standardizing that and adding it as part of the starter culture, and they were phasing out raw milk, and it became illegal to use raw milk at the end of the 1980s. And so when they protected Stilton, what they were really doing was trying to protect us against foreign imports. So there was a really ropey looking American Stilton with a Big Ben on the label that was being imported, and that's what they were there to protect. Not the meaning, the spiritual gestal of the cheese. Forget it. It was an economic decision for the most part. Did they love their Stilton? Yes. Was it part of their identity? Surely. But did they see it as having the kind of meaning that cheeses like Bleu de Termignon might have had in France at the time? I wonder. I guess that's what I'm questioning. So tell me what you think. And so essentially in 2006, so this is how recent it is, Randolph Hodgson, who's godfather, I would say, of modern British terroir cheese, can't have enough respect for him, had a conversation with Joe Snyder where they were like, well, look, cheese can be so much more. So they were really the products of baby boomers that had been able to travel for the first time, experience cheese. So usually it was an upper class thing to go on a grand tour, but everyone went on a grand tour in the 70s and 80s, and then brought back some of this new way of seeing food. And I would argue that that's kind of taken for granted in British gastronomy, where they still use French nomenclature. Even for something like cooking, they use the word cuisson, which is this idea that someone like Tom Kitchen in Edinburgh can work with Pierre Kaufmann, think about poulet de Bresse, think about what a dish might mean, that it is art, that it is culture, that it is religion even, and then take that back and look at the produce of Scotland, its dishes, its identity, its landscape, with new eyes. These are new eyes. It's a new way of seeing, and it takes nothing away from British gastronomy for them to be so in awe of France's past. And I would argue the same applies to British cheese. And so, you end up with this project that essentially they are resurrecting. So they describe themselves as resurrecting Stilton, and I'm saying that they are creating a new terroir for Stilton from scratch, and they're doing a bloody good job of it. So now we're on to our ostensibly new wave cheeses. So Elric Log looks like a Loire Valley goat's cheese. Has terroir, I would argue, because it's made on peat ground. It tastes completely different from anything in the region, and as a result, you have something that's seemingly very new. Okay. So Humphrey Errington is another kind of roving cultural tourist, I guess, in a sense, who wants to resurrect or build, I suppose is the right word, Scottish artisan cheese. Chooses the Lacone breed of sheep to make Lanark Blue. Lanark Blue is almost a Roquefort recipe, but the cheese is undeniably the product of Lancashire. And that's because the introduction of this foreign breed of sheep, this foreign way of looking at food and being excited by it, is about as old school British as it gets. If you think about the heyday of Georgian cuisine, it was partly because of the escaping French chefs from the French Revolution. It's British to do this. And so in that case, Elric Log, this idea, it's pragmatic because you make it during the months when you can't milk sheep. So it's good for everyone working there. It's good for the industry, but also it takes a bit of inspiration from France. It looks at cheese in what was a French way and is now a British way, hopefully. And we'll continue to kind of push on with that, changing our culture to look at things like this. And then you end up with a cheese that is in the grand tradition of the greatest of British cuisine. Starts with the Eccles cake and ends with here. So this Loire Valley goat's cheese knockoff, if you look at it in the wrong way, is just as British as the Eccles cake if you look at it in the right way. And it's completely delicious and one of my favourite goat's cheeses in Europe right now, full stop. So now we're on to Byron Bygod. I think no one would disagree with the fact that this is simultaneous an old wave and a new wave cheese. They were making brie styles in Norfolk in the 12th century. They stopped and now they've reissued this. But the maker of this cheese is again one of my heroes because he's really kick-started the raw milk revolution in this country. If you had at any point up to the point in which we changed our way of looking at cheese, tried to tell the public and farmers that we should revert in their eyes to raw milk, they would have said why. Not necessarily because of worries about danger, but they would like, well, it's just more difficult to do. I don't see the point. And then if you were to answer at the time in 1950, 1850, 1750, 1650, that raw milk might have more meaning than pasteurized milk, and therefore that's an end in and of itself, something we should be aiming at, you would have got a blank stare at best. So this is a modern brie. It's a new wave cheese, but it's also absolutely an old wave cheese as well. So fantastic. I think that's definitely one of my favourite cheeses, and I think that it's at the vanguard of British artisan terroir-led cheese making. So really, really happy to be showing it to people. So now we're on to St James. St James, I would argue, is no less British in kind of thinking, and no less a British terroir cheese than even the wonderful Caerphilly that we started off with. So this, at first blush, if you're a French cheese lover, reminds you a little bit of even something like a Sunal or a Clausu from the legendary Cevennes. Probably not as good now as they were. They're not even as good now in my experience as they were when I started my job. But this is a British cheesemaker getting something equal to that within a short space of time, really developing a new Cumbrian terroir from scratch, whereas these other cheeses took generations, if not millennia, to do the same job. So it's a pretty towering achievement, basically. And so this has a very British terroir because it's based not on a group like in France. So you go to Franche-Comté, you can only make a handful of cheeses. They're never ascribed to one person. It's about the identity of the commune. British culture outside of food has always been about the individual. The godfathers of cheddar, it's individuals, it's not regions. And every cheese on this board, whether you look at a label, we talk about a person, be it Mary Holbrook, Mrs. Kirkham, Jamie Montgomery. And so they're all single individual terroirs in their own right, I would say. So St. James is an interesting one because it has very British preoccupations. Animal welfare, they only milk one time a day rather than two. He's looked outside for wash rinds, which were never traditionally British because we'd never have thought to do that, because that's all about flavour and it's not about and pleasure, and it's got nothing to do with economics, wash rinds for the most part. And essentially it's made with a starter culture. So one of the key things for me about a terroir cheese is that it's got a local starter, that the pasture changes throughout the year, that there's some seasonality in the cheese, that decisions are made in the fermentation that are about quality, but defined as the importance and the meaning of the cheese rather than just whether it's tasty or not. These are all very new ideas. And so, yes, we do definitely have much more freedom with cheese production in this country than anywhere else. Because of that, we actually don't have a past shackling us to, we just have an imagined past, if anything, shackling us to a certain way of making cheese. And so this cheese was awarded the Nuffield Farming Scholarship to study. So the maker, was awarded a scholarship to study the prevalence and importance of indigenous bacterial cultures in raw milk cheese. Now that sounds very British and empirical, but really it's about the end that it's directed at. So in the past, during the cheese Enlightenment, and certainly during the 19th century, and then in the 50s with things like Helveticus cheddar, the idea of understanding the science of cheese was always aimed at a very empirical British end, which is yield and consistency. So this science award, as science sounding as it is really aimed at culture. It's the relevance of indigenous microbes in producing a cheese with terroir, and terroir is not just an intrinsic objective quality, it's also an extrinsic continental philosophy based way of seeing, and so that science and culture and art and philosophy and moral philosophy all coming together in a neat, lovely little ball that tastes as good as any wash rind in France currently, and I'm so proud to have it. It really makes me proud to be British, and really excited about the future. And so our final cheese, well, before that, I would say that the St. James really is a labour of love to create rather than rediscover a terroir. And so I'm saying that all of these cheeses are new wave, and that's because they don't rediscover a terroir because that doesn't exist. They are creating it anew. And then some are taking inspiration from the end of the 19th century, fair enough, and some are taking inspiration from across the pond or across the channel, and fair enough too, and some are taking inspiration, I would argue whether they realise it or not, from cheeses in Britain much further back than that. So there's this idea, right, that essentially as I was saying earlier, might question the idea of placing too much importance on the territorial cheeses of the end of the 19th century, this battle royale. And I'd like to give you a kind of hypothetical. Let's say you were thinking about the Auvergne, and then the Auvergne had a similar, and France had a similar British food culture to Britain, and they were essentially working out which cheese to call Auvergne cheese, and they ended up with modern supermarket Cantal at the end of the 19th century. And so Fond-Dombert, Saint-Nectaire, Salaise, Layol, and many others, would all have gone through this procedure where they battled against each other. It was a fight, and then what came out was the most pragmatic and the most easy to produce. Now, I was talking to my girlfriend about this, who is, might be hard to believe, a little bit more succinct than I am. And she essentially said, I guess it's like history is written by the winning cheese. So when it comes to territorials, history is written by the winning cheese. But maybe that book is not the page turner that we'd like it to be, in a nutshell. And so if in that hypothetical situation you ended up with supermarket Cantal at the end of the 19th century, and then French cheesemaking gets decimated in the 20th century, and in the 21st century they're thinking about which Auvergne cheese to make, you might say that maybe that's not the one to pick. You can pick it, absolutely, but it's maybe, I'll rephrase this, maybe that's not the one to restrict yourself to. And I guess that's the challenge of the question that I'm posing here. St James is no less a British cheese, no less a British terroir cheese for not being related to the cheese that might have been made in Cumbria when we didn't care about cheese so much as we do now. And it's kind of, I think, what people refer to as temporally parochial, this idea that some other time is arbitrarily more relevant than this. We've been in a process of constant change for the last 1,000 years. Recent immigration is a myth. Immigration is British culture, and assimilation is British culture. And St James is just as British as Wensleydale, 100%. So now we're on to Beanie Blue. This is the most interesting one of the lot. Looks like the newest wave cheese, made in the 70s, inspired by Roquefort, made with a Lacombe breed of sheep. But actually it takes us full circle, because it's rather than the kind of arbitrary cheeses that ended up with this kind of fight, this game that no modern cheese lover would agree to the rules of, where you end up with a crumbly cheese, cow's milk cheese. This is the closest modern British cheese to the cheeses that would have been made in the abbeys in the hillsides of the north of England. Sheep's milk, crumbly, blue. Nothing like a Roquefort, even though it's based on it, just as those cheeses were nothing like a Roquefort, though they were based on them. And it has a beautiful flavour. It's one of my favourite blue cheeses in Europe, and really delicious and complex sherry, toffee notes. It's nutty, it's spicy, it's fruity, it's long and clean, it's crumbly and fresh, it's seasonal. It's everything that you could possibly want a British cheese to be, and I would argue that it's perhaps the first new British cheese that replicates first new British terroir cheese that replicates perhaps the last British terroir cheese made before the onslaught of the old Puritans. So in that sense, thanks for sticking with me through that. Hopefully there's lots to think about, and if you disagree with any or all of what I've just said, then that's a good thing. I truly think that, and I love nothing more than changing my mind, so do let us know. But in terms of what's next for British artisan cheese, by understanding that British terroir and British artisan cheese has changed, that we're only making terroir cheeses for the first time now, then we're like the British wine industry. The world is full of possibilities. We're like the American artisan cheese industry. There's no past holding us back. It's all about what we decide to be next. And I think that's understanding terroir properly, that it's cultural, that it's about a certain set of standards, that it's about a way of seeing the importance of cheese, and then we can be quite clear about which cheeses have it and which don't, that we don't protect artisan cheese by redefining it out of all meaning, that we have a bright British cheese future. And based on this play, we have an amazing British cheese culture right now, so it's just ours to mess up, basically. So a unique British definition of terroir, I think, is partly, if terroir has culture at its heart, then British cheese food culture itself is outward looking. Therefore, our cheese making, British terroir cheese making, should be outward looking. And it doesn't make sense to define this board in terms of old and new. It's all new wave, but it also brings out the best of what British food culture's been at its best, which is interested in the outside world and not inward looking and not stuck to tradition. And so finally, as I said, I don't think we should limit ourselves to an imagined past. We can use it as inspiration just like Dinner by Heston Blumenthal makes brutally modern food based on inspirations from British food history. There's no harm in doing that. It's a wonderful creative constraint, but it shouldn't be the only way of doing things. And secondly, I think about the Beatles when I think about British cheese. The Beatles are amazing. You take nothing away from the Beatles by admitting that they wouldn't be there without Buddy Holly. This idea that to be a true fan of the Beatles is to not listen to American rock and roll music and deny its influence. We wouldn't have the Rolling Stones and the Beatles without rock and roll, which is an American art form. We wouldn't have British terroir cheeses without French terroir cheeses, because terroir is a French art form. If that needs to be stated, let me state it. It's a French art form. It's now a British one, and we're now arguably doing it better than anyone else. But let's be real about this. Let's have a reality check. And so I think that if we want to be the Beatles and the Rolling Stones of the cheese world, and I think we are already, and we can continue to be more that, then we want to be acknowledging where we get this way of seeing from and apply it to everything we do in the future. So it's not what cheese would the French make, but how might they view a decision to do things this way or that? What can we learn from that, basically? And so in conclusion, this cheese board and modern British cheese culture and artisanship reflects Britain's truly unique historical trait. And that's her willingness to absorb the best of other cultures and create her own world-class responses, basically. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm really sorry for overrunning. And thanks for spending some time with us. Hopefully you've moved on to the other talk already and you're watching this in a video. But either way, have a lovely evening and we hope to see you soon. And I wanted to say thank you to the Academy of Cheese for inviting us to be a part of this. So many of my food heroes have been part of this weekend. So yeah, it's an amazing honour to be part of it. So thank you so much and have a lovely evening. Okay, bye-bye.